Good evening. Once again, it's Nanaja coming to you from Arlington, Virginia. It's Monday, December 9th, 2013. And in honor of Nelson Mandela, today I want to talk about stereotype threat. I think this is very apt because of what Nelson Mandela achieved in South Africa. We all know the story. Certainly a freedom fighter who was jailed for 27 years, came out, lost his bitterness, and united a nation made up of people of many races. Stereotype threat is a phenomenon coined by Professor Claude Steele. There's a link below to Professor Steele of Stanford University. Certainly he's half black, half white, and so he was able to aptly capture this because of his experiences with both races. But essentially, stereotype threat in the gist is a phenomena where when a person from a specific group to which specific stereotypes have been attributed to is faced with dealing with other groups, when there's a subtle hint or reminder of those stereotypes, even if they're equally able as the other groups, they tend to reinforce the stereotypes, particularly negative stereotypes based on the perceptions of what their group is. And this in its sense becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's called stereotype threat. A few examples. When traditionally women in the science and math field are perceptually viewed to be not as capable as men. In other words, the perception is women don't have the same aptitude as men in the sciences and the math field. And so when women scientists in NASA and other places, and there's research to back this, are engaging with their colleagues of the opposite sex, and there's a subtle hint of this perception, the women tend to self-fulfill that perception based on the psychological fear. Hence, the stereotype threat is reinforced. Another example, in standardized testing, particularly in the United States, when African American kids who've received the same level of education as white kids are put in a standardized testing scenario, particularly when they have to identify themselves by race, i.e. black, African American, and so forth, they tend to underperform, even with the same attitude, when compared with white kids. However, when the absence of the stereotype threat is created, the African American kids tend to do as well or better than white kids of the same educational background and training and exposure. The same can be said for the perception that white men can't jump. I think we've all seen the movie with Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson, two aspiring street basketball players, where Woody Harrelson, being the white player, is incredibly talented, but because of the stereotype threat saying white men can't jump, he has a terrible time trying to dunk. And the protagonist, Wesley Snipes, tends to make fun of him. We all know this is not true, because has anyone heard of Larry Bird, Manu Ginobili, and many others? So that notion is not true, but in this case the stereotype threat prevails and it happens. So to the point, when you find yourself in a workplace scenario and you're Arab, black, a woman, white male, white woman, and there's a prevailing stereotype, you must be aware of your emotional and psychological responses to these things, because stereotype threat inevitably can hinder and does hinder performance, job performance. I've often had stories from friends, some African Americans, some Africans, who have said, I just can't play the game. I'm excluded. In some cases, there's no doubt that there may be real exclusion. In other cases, it could be the presence of stereotype threat, which is perceptual. So what I would offer is that one, be aware of what stereotype threat is and be able to delineate the difference from a scenario where stereotype threat informs one's attitude towards work and hinders one from performing at peak levels, and distinguish that from what may be overt discrimination. And in this case, it can happen to women, it can happen to people of different sexual orientation, different national origin backgrounds, and so forth. So not necessarily a black or white phenomena. But I think once one is able to establish that stereotype threat can indeed play a role in how one views one's ability to perform, then the psychological blocks of optimum peak performance, which opens doors to promotions, job security, learning, and growth, will become more present. And in this case, one is able to open oneself to people of different personalities, different backgrounds, who can bring a lot of value in one's own career development. I always go back and say, remember the case of Nelson Mandela and what he did with particularly the 1995 Rugby World Cup in South Africa. The Springboks. That team was the beloved symbol of the Afrikaners. And the black people of South Africa wanted that symbol destroyed, until Nelson Mandela was able to bridge that gap and say, let's not reinforce stereotypes. This is a rainbow nation, a nation of black and white, and purple, and green, and yellow. I'm being facetious, but you get the theme. It's not an easy feat to look oneself in the mirror and determine what's real and what's not. But it's important to focus on areas where bridges can be built. I'm going to make this video very short. I think I've gone on for too long. But once again, try to understand what your own stereotype threat could be aware of it, and overcome it. Next week I'll talk a bit more about your value proposition. Until then, peace and shalom.